China is one of the countries that has the most to lose if the Strait of Hormuz stops functioning. Normally, that is the fact that makes the whole story so strange. China is the world's largest buyer of Iranian oil. A huge share of that oil moves through Hormuz. If that artery is disrupted, Chinese refiners, Chinese factories, Chinese planners, and the wider Chinese growth machine all feel the pressure. So why did China veto the resolution that supposedly aimed to reopen it? That is the real entry point, because the real story is not that China backed Iran. The real story is that China looked at the solution and decided the solution was more dangerous than the disruption. That is what the world missed. On the 7th of April, inside the UN Security Council, the vote looked simple on the surface. A resolution, originally proposed by Bahrain, was framed around restoring freedom of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. The public version of the argument was clean: reopen the route, calm the markets, prevent wider damage, restore order. Then China and Russia vetoed it. The headline snapped into place almost instantly. China shields Iran, Russia shields Iran. Beijing is risking the global economy to protect a partner. Simple, clean, and strategically shallow, because the real meaning of the vote was hiding in one phrase: all necessary means. That was the hinge. That was the whole fight in diplomatic language. That phrase is never just decorative wording. It is legal oxygen for force. It is how a shipping problem becomes a military mandate. Once those words appear, the question is no longer only whether traffic moves through a waterway. The question becomes who gets to reopen the waterway, under what legitimacy, and with what precedent attached. That is why the drafting history matters so much. The original text was much more aggressive. China pushed back, Russia pushed back. Even France resisted parts of the first version. The draft was softened, the language was diluted, more direct enforcement language was stripped back, and China still vetoed it. That detail changes everything. If Beijing's objection had only been to the harshest wording, then the watered-down version should have been acceptable. It was not, which means China was not vetoing a sentence. It was vetoing a strategic restoration. That is the first thing to understand from Beijing's perspective. The problem was not simply that the United States wanted Hormuz reopened. The problem was that Washington wanted Hormuz reopened under a structure that would have re-legitimized American control over one of the world's most important energy choke points. That is a much bigger issue. Because if the United States reopens Hormuz by force with international legitimacy attached, then the message to the world is not only that shipping has resumed. The message is that when the most important energy artery on the planet is threatened, the final guarantor is still the United States. That is the nightmare Beijing was looking at. Not temporary disruption, restored hierarchy. China has lived with some version of this fear for years. The Malacca Dilemma captured it in one geographic zone. But the logic is broader. If China's industrial machine can still be strangled through maritime routes that its main rival can ultimately police, then all the talk about Chinese rise, self-reliance, and strategic autonomy sits on a weaker foundation than Beijing wants to admit. Now, extend that logic to Hormuz. Imagine the United States not only controlling the practical reopening of the strait, but doing so with unbacked legitimacy. Imagine the whole world being reminded that the route feeding the world's largest manufacturing economy still runs through an order whose final military guarantor remains Washington. That is not a temporary inconvenience for China. That is strategic humiliation. And that is why the first layer of the veto is simple. China was willing to absorb short-term pain in exchange for blocking long-term dependence from being publicly revalidated. The Western reading assumed that because Beijing needed the route open, Beijing must support any mechanism that reopened it. China saw something else. It saw a trade open route now, but under restored American authorship, or endure disruption now, and refused to help re-legitimize the system it has spent years trying to escape. That is not a contradiction, that is strategy. Now go one layer deeper. Hormuz is not only a shipping route, it is part of the architecture of the petrodollar system. That matters more than most headlines will ever admit. For decades, the oil trade running through dollar channels has reinforced U.S. financial dominance. Energy trade creates demand for dollars. Those dollars cycle back into U.S. assets. The financial system and the energy system support each other. So when Hormuz becomes unstable, the damage is not limited to barrels. The damage begins touching the dollar-centered order wrapped around those barrels. That is where China sees opportunity inside danger, because Beijing has spent years building alternatives that look secondary in calm times but become more important. Under stress, yuan-based settlement experiments, cross-border payment systems, Belt and Road financial plumbing, deeper energy ties with Russia and Iran, none of them fully replace the dollar in a stable world. But that is not the environment China is thinking about. It is thinking about fracture in stable times. Alternatives look inefficient. In stress times, alternatives look prudent. That is the whole point. Every week Hormuz remains unstable is another week the old energy. Financial order looks less automatic. Every week of instability pushes more countries to ask whether the system they were told was permanent might actually need backup options. That is why Beijing can tolerate pain here. Because Beijing is not only measuring the direct cost of disruption, it is measuring the systemic cost of who gets to solve the disruption. And from China's point of view, an American military solution with international blessing does something very dangerous. It restores confidence in the old order at the exact moment Beijing wants more countries to begin doubting it. That is the second layer of the veto. This was not simply about current oil flows. It was about future monetary power. Now go deeper. Again, a lot of people assume China acted out of reflex, anti-American instinct, routine, solidarity, geopolitical habit. That is too shallow. China has spent years preparing for a world where choke points, sanctions, and maritime vulnerability become more central. Strategic petroleum reserves, supplier diversification, massive domestic build-out in solar, wind, nuclear, and coal flexibility. Overland corridors, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, links through the international north-south transport corridor. These are not random infrastructure hobbies. They are buffers against an unstable system, not immunity buffers. That distinction matters. China did not veto because it thought disruption was painless. China vetoed because it judged the pain manageable compared with the strategic damage of helping restore American legitimacy over the choke point order. That is a very different kind of calculation from the one embedded in the headlines. And now we reach the legal and narrative layer, which may be the most valuable part of all at the Security Council. China emphasized that the resolution did not address the root causes of the conflict. Russia made a similar point. You do not need to agree with that argument to understand why it matters globally, because much of the non-Western world already views the so-called rules-based order. With deep suspicion, many governments across Asia, Africa, and Latin America have watched the same pattern for years: intervention first, legal cover later, force first, justification afterward. So when China says no to a resolution that still looks, even in softened form, like a path for legitimized force against a state that was already struck militarily, Beijing is not just making a procedural move. It is building narrative power. It is telling the global South, we will not automatically authorize another military solution wrapped in the language of order. That message resonates. And in geopolitics, resonance is leverage because wars are never fought only in the military dimension. They're fought in 4 dimensions at once: military, economic, political, narrative. And if you want to know who is really gaining ground, you have to track all 4. That takes us to the biggest layer. This vote was not just about Hormuz. It was about whether the old system still repairs itself automatically for decades after the Cold War. The United States enjoyed something close to institutional reflex. If Washington wanted to isolate sanction pressure, intervene, or legalize its preferred path, the system often bent far enough to help. Russia was too weak to block much of it. China was not yet prepared to resist at scale. The result was a kind of global habit. American strategic necessity often became international legitimacy. That era is fading, and the 7th of April veto is one of the clearest signs yet. The United States sought legitimacy for what it framed as an essential outcome around one of the most important maritime choke points in the world. It did not get it, not because of procedure, not because of delay, because 2 major powers said no. That is what multipolarity looks like when it stops being theory and becomes event. A visible limit, a real limit, a limit attached to one of the world's core energy arteries. That is why the vote mattered so much more than the headlines suggested. Militarily, China shaped the field without firing a shot. Economically, it accepted near-term pain for a more dangerous restoration of petrodollar, Bakshin maritime hierarchy. Politically, it positioned itself as a defender of sovereignty rather than a passive approver of selective intervention. Narratively, it strengthened its standing across the global South as a state willing to block the automatic legalization of Western force. That is a significant gain from one veto, which is why the core conclusion is so simple. China did not veto because it misunderstood its interests. China vetoed because it understood them too clearly to mistake a restoration for a solution. An easy question was always, why would China block the reopening of a route it depends on? The real question was, why would China ever help legitimize an American-led military solution that restores the very strategic order Beijing has spent years trying to weaken? That is the answer. That is the meaning of the vote. This was not hesitation. It was not confusion. It was not reflex. It was a declaration that the old system no longer gets to repair itself automatically. China did not stop the reopening of Hormuz. China stopped the reopening of American legitimacy over Hormuz. And that may matter much more than the shipping lane itself,